Hello, this is How To Bob. In this video I'm going to show you how to rebuild the guts of a toilet tank. Now I've got this Fluid Master kit here, and this contains everything I'm going to need to replace the guts to this toilet. Now this is a really old Mansfield toilet, and you can see that when I turn the water on it just keeps running and running and running and running. So I'm going to go ahead and replace the entire inside of the tank. So first thing I want to do is turn off the water at the supply and make sure that that's off all the way. Next thing, I'm going to go down to the side. I'm going to put a towel down there, and then I'll put a bucket underneath where the supply line hooks up, because once I take the supply line off right here, it's probably going to leak some water. Now, I'm doing this in the basement, so it's not that big a deal, but you may be doing this type work in a bathroom, so you won't want to flood the bathroom. So once I get that loosened up, I can pull the supply line out of the way, and not too much water came out of there. Next, I'm going to take off the locking nut on the fill valve. I use my channel locks and get them under there, and I just loosen that up, and then I can remove my fill valve. Once I get this loosened up all the way, I can remove my fill valve from the top of the tank, and it might be pressed in there with the rubber washer, so you just have to rock it back and forth, and then you can gently pull up on the fill valve, the old fill valve, and it'll come off. And you can see this is where it went through, and now it comes right out. So I want to disconnect the filler hose or filler tube, and I can take my fill valve out of the way now. Took my gasket off. Now my next thing is to remove the 3 bolts that hold the tank to the bowl. This one has 3. A lot of the newer toilets will only have 2. Actually, only 2 of these bolts go through the bowl, and the last one is more of like a stability thing, and I'll show you that when I go back and reassemble it. So I've got all my bolts loose, and again, you're going to lose some water here, so you can see they're kind of corroded, and the washers are non-existent, so that was causing some leakage there, I'm sure. And got all 3 of them to take out. Once I get all 3 of those out, I can lift the tank off. Now I'm going to set my tank out here. First I want to take the donut gasket off here and kind of clean that up. But I'm going to take my tank out here so I can work on it. It's a little bit easier to work on once you get it out in the open. So here's my tank. I want to remove the bottom lock nut that's holding the flush valve on, so I kind of hold the center. This one's a little more difficult than some of the other ones that I've had to take off before, but just get a pair of channel locks and loosen the outer nut here, and it should come out fairly easy. This one's been on there quite a long time, as this is a really old toilet. Once I get that loose, I can take my flush valve out from the top here. This is the old flush valve, so I can get rid of that. I don't need that any longer. Next, I'm going to take off my lever and handle, and on this, take note that it is a left-handed thread, so I want to turn it right-handed to loosen it. You'll see that I'm turning it right. Make sure that you do turn this in the opposite direction. It'll feel weird, but you want to make sure you do it that way. So I'm going to go back in with my new flush valve, and first thing I'm going to take the nut off the bottom, and there's a little cardboard piece that I took off already on the flapper. So then I put my flush valve in from the top, and then I put my locking nut in at the bottom, and then I can make sure it's positioned in the correct way. Then I come back in and lightly tighten it. It don't have to be real tight. It's made out of plastic. It will break. I don't want to snap the plastic or possibly break the porcelain. So now I've got my new fill valve, and I want to make sure it's about the same height. That'll make it easier adjusted outside of the tank. And you'll see I've got the rubber shank washer that goes on. There's a beveled end and a flat end. The flat end is going to go on first, and the beveled end will go into the tank. You can see the beveled end here. That's going to go into the tank, and I just set that down in the hole where the old fill valve was. And I take my locking nut and I go down to the bottom, and I hold my fill valve in place while I tighten that. They say to do it by hand tight. I usually give it a little bit tighter turn, just a little bit, not too awful much, just a little bit, with the channel locks to make sure that I got it in there good and tight. Once you get that all done, we can get the bolts. And the bolts are going to have a rubber washer, a washer, and a nut. And it goes with the rubber washer in first. Then that can go into the tank once I get it seated in there. That goes into the tank. And then I can put my stainless steel washer on the bottom. And then I go and put my nut on after that. And that gets tightened down so that the washer will seal off the tank. Now I'm only going to do 2 of these because this tank, the third one, actually has a little bracket or brace that I'll have to put on as I'm putting the tank back on the bowl. But most of the newer toilets only have 2 bolts. And you can see here's the second one. I'll just do the same thing. Put the rubber washer on, put the steel washer on the back side, and then the nut. And I want to go ahead and tighten that up fairly decent, not real tight. You got to be careful when you're working with porcelain not to crack it. So now I've got all my nuts and washers and bolts on the tank. I want to make sure they're all good and tight. I've got the third one on here, and now I'm going to put my rubber gasket on here. It fits down over top of the big locking nut that I put in there. I want to make sure that it goes all the way to the top of the tank, and it'll get crushed in between the tank and the bowl, and that's what causes it to seal up when the water runs from your tank to your bowl. So you can see it's nice and beveled there, and that'll just sit right in the part that I cleaned off earlier in the video right here, and that'll form a real good seal once we tighten down all the bolts here. So I just want to line up all my bolts, and you can see there's only 2 holes in the bottom of the bowl, so I'm going to have to take that other one off to make room for my bracket. So now that I've got it all setting on the bowl, the tank sitting on the bowl, I'm going to go back in with a rubber washer, then a steel washer, and then I come back in with the nut. And the reason the rubber washer's on there is to keep the pressure from cracking the bowl when it gets tightened up. And I'm going to just hand tighten that up. I don't want it to be real tight, but I want it to be hand tight. And while I'm doing this, I will keep the tank as level as possible. Now I'm going to go to the other side and repeat the same process. I'll put the rubber washer in, then I'll put the stainless steel washer in, and then I will come back in with the nut and I'll hand tighten it. At the same time, I'll be leveling the tank because I don't want one side tighter than the other. Now I can come back with an adjustable wrench, and I want to just do a few turns on one side, a few turns on the other side to make sure that I don't get one side tighter than the other, or else I would end up with a tank that's sitting on the bowl lopsided or crooked. So I want to make sure I just a little bit at a time here and there. You don't want it to get too tight, or you could break, the porcelain. Give it a little jiggle here and there to make sure that it's getting a little tighter, but you don't want it to be overly tightened. Okay, now that I've got my 2 bolts tightened evenly, I can go ahead and put my bracket on here. This is like a wishbone kind of bracket, and it connects to the front 2 bolts, and then that kind of holds the back bolt, and that keeps the toilet tank from swiveling back and forth or rocking. So what I do is just put my nut on there on each side, and then I go back to the back one and I'll put a washer and a nut on each one and kind of tighten them down. They don't have to be super tight. The back one, it's more important that it is tight so that it kind of smushes the rubber washer that's on the inside of the tank, causing it to seal it off real well inside the tank. And again, I want to alternate from left to right, and then I want to go to the back. And once I do this, I'll notice that my tank is very, very tight. Now you may not have to do this. Like I said, most toilets today come with only 2 bolts, and they're set up that way. So the instructions on this kit that I have only said that it's set up for 2, and they said to reuse the 1. So I'm all done at the bottom. Now I can hook up my filler tube, and that just hooks right onto the fill valve. And there's a little clamp that goes over top, so I slide my clamp over, and then I take the other end and the little clamp on the end here. I'll have to slide that back. Let me get that out of the way. And then that goes onto the hose, the refill clip here. This clip, and will go onto the filler tube. And I just have to put my clamp back on and put the filler clip right onto the hose. And next is my handle. So I slide that in the hole. And again, don't forget that these are backwards thread or left-handed thread. So to tighten it, you want to turn it left. It's kind of awkward if you're used to doing threads, but it's always the left-handed. And just put that on tight. Doesn't have to be real super tight. I'll go ahead and give it just a little snug up with the channel locks, not much. Then I'm going to get my chain that's hooked to the flapper here. And I want to make sure I don't have too much slack so that it gets caught in the flapper. And that looks pretty good. So then I can go back down underneath and I can hook my supply line up. So I just move that right over there again. And I can take my nut and tighten it back on by hand. Give it a little bit of a turn with the old channel locks. And I'm ready to give it a test. So I'm going to turn the water back on and we'll see how she works. So now I just wait for my tank to fill up with water. And this is an older Mansfield toilet, and it's going to take a little while because it's got a lot of water to go. And this flapper down here is adjustable. If you want to adjust it for how much water it flushes or how hard it flushes, you can do that also. So once it gets all filled up, I'm going to give it a test run. Flush it a couple times, make sure that the chain doesn't get caught under the flapper. Then I just put the lid back on, and that's how you rebuild a toilet tank. I'm How To Bob. Thanks for watching.